I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best video on CSS selectors you're going to find anywhere on YouTube. This video is a comprehensive full course that covers every single detail you need to know to master CSS selectors. Unlike other tutorials that just talk over code, my teaching style is interactive and visual to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. I use colorful diagrams and animations to break down the theory in an easy to understand way, as well as walk you through its application step by step in a real-world project. So let's jump in. Let's begin by learning how to style elements directly based on their HTML tag with the type selector. We'll be discussing CSS selectors and the type selector. So let's start off by taking a broad look at CSS selectors. Selectors allow us to select HTML elements to apply CSS rules. For example, on this H1, we're applying a font size and color. The H1 is the selector. Now, this is one of the most basic selectors you've likely come across already. But there are in fact a range of CSS selectors. There is a large range of CSS selectors that allow us to apply styles from broad styling to specific visual details. I've broken this down into 4 categories. The first are basic selectors. These include element selectors and things like IDs and classes, which we'll be talking about soon. Basic selectors are used a lot. They are the most common type of selector used. Next up, we have combinator selectors. This is where the selector is defined by combining 2 different types of selectors. We'll also be looking at this selector later on. Next up are pseudo-class selectors. These type of selectors apply when a different state or condition is met. For example, hovering over an anchor tag. They're really important and we will be discussing them soon. The last type of selector is a pseudo-element selector. These selectors can target a specific part of an element. As you can see, there's a wide range of different selectors, and we'll be going through each of them in great detail in this topic. Let's look at the most basic type of selector, the type selector, otherwise known as the element selector. The type selector selects elements based on their tag name. We target a specific HTML element like an H1. This is called the type selector. Let's now take a look at some type selector guidance. The type selector is useful for setting global styles to ensure consistency. The word global just means applies everywhere. For example, these are 2 different pages from the same web application. If we look at the main heading on the left here, this is an H1, and it's styled a specific way. If we look on the right, this H1 is also styled the exact same way. So the CSS styling is defined on the H1 using the type selector. We can see the same thing for the paragraph text. That has specific styling, like color and line height. And the paragraph on the right also has these exact same styles. Finally, the button over here, which is an anchor tag, has specific styling, like a navy blue background color and rounded corners. And the button on the other page also has these same rules applied to it. So you can see that the type selector is particularly useful for setting global styles on elements which can be used throughout the project. Now that you've mastered the theory so far in this video, it's important to understand how we can use it in a real-world web application. For this part of the video, I recommend you download the starter HTML and CSS files in the description below and code along with me. We will be working on the homepage for a major full-stack web application called Quill, which you can learn more about in the description below. This project is part of my CSS full course, where we build the Quill homepage from scratch. You can join me for free in my CSS full course on YouTube by clicking in the video appearing in the top right now. Now in the starter file, you can see global styles have already been applied to text elements. For example, the styling on our H3, which is used in several places on the homepage, is defined once using the type selector. We've given it specific values for font weight, line height, letter spacing, etc. And if we check out this element in the browser, we'll see that it has consistent styling. The H3 is used down here for our different features. We have an H3 over here and an H3 over here. And you can see the styling is consistent because it's defined once on the H3 using the type selector. We can see the same thing for our paragraph. all the paragraphs on the homepage all look the same, with the same font weight, line height, color, etc. So the type selector is really useful for defining global styles on different HTML elements. And just remember, when we start adding more pages to the application, the same styles applied on our type selector will also apply on those new pages. So let's wrap up and start building the next summary card, basic selectors and the cascade. We looked at the type selector. The type selector selected an HTML element, like an H1. This is an example of the type selector. And in the guidance, we saw it was used for setting global styles. Next, we'll explore how CSS rules are applied and prioritized as a concept known as the cascade. We'll be discussing style priority and style sheet priority. So what is the cascade? The word cascade means flows from one stage to the next. When I grew up in Australia, I'd often go bushwalking, and there'd be a river system called a cascade, where pools of water would flow from one to the other. In the context of CSS, the cascade is about how styles declared later will take priority. Let's have a look at an example. In this piece of code, we're selecting the H1 twice. In the first declaration block, we're giving the H1 a color of blue, and in the second one, we're giving the H1 a color of green. This is what is known as conflicting selectors. Because of the cascade, the later style will take priority. So in this case, green overrides blue, and the H1 will appear as green on the web page. Let's take a look at this inside VS Code. I'm on the app.css file for our Quill project. In this declaration block, I've defined styles for my H1. I'm going to go and select the H1 again, and let's go add the same properties but with different values now. I'll give it a font size of 100 pixels, which is significantly larger than 62. And I'm going to give it the color of red, which is very different to the gray shade we defined here. So let's check this out in the browser. So look what's happened. Our H1 now is the color red with a font size of 100 pixels. These styles are overriding the styles here, specifically the color and the font size. All the other properties are still retained from the first declaration block. For example, the font weight is still 700, the letter spacing is still -2 pixels, etc. So the idea of the cascade is really important. You need to appreciate that a style sheet is kind of dynamic, where styles targeting the same element that are applied later will override those that are applied earlier. Now at this stage, it may not seem so obvious why we'd declare a second H1. It would make more sense just to define all your styles inside your first H1. Now doing this isn't so typical, but we're going to see soon how we can take advantage of the cascade to write more efficient CSS. Now, not only do styles declared later take priority, but also style sheets declared later will take priority. For example, let's say we had an index.html file, and we have these two style sheets, app.css and app2.css. In app.css, we have the CSS rule h1 has a font size of 12 pixels, and in app2.css, we have an h1 with a font size of 52 pixels. So because app2.css is declared after app.css, the font size 52 pixels overrides 12 pixels from the previous style sheet. Let's look at this in action inside VS Code. Okay, I'm first just going to remove this H1. We don't need it anymore. I'm then going to go add a new tab. On my Mac, I'm hitting Command N. I'll select a language, CSS, and I'll straight away save this inside our Quill directory as app2.css. I'm now going to head over to index.html and add this style sheet after our first one. I'll grab the link tag and set the href value to app2.css. So as you can see, our app2.css is defined after our app.css. So whatever styles we define in this style sheet that conflict with the first style sheet will override them. This time, let's target the H2 element. We'll give it a color of green, a font size of 10 pixels, so significantly smaller, and let's also give it a letter spacing of 4 pixels. Alright, let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our H2 down here. It's now green, has a much smaller font size, and the letters are more spread out. And as we've discussed, this is occurring because the styles in our second style sheet are overriding the first style sheet. And again, just to reiterate, the order here is really important. Because our app2.css is a later style sheet, styles declared here will take priority. I'm just going to go remove this file and delete it, and remove the link tag, because we don't need it moving forward. Now again, you may be thinking, when am I going to need a second style sheet? Why wouldn't I just define everything in my first style sheet? As we move through the CSS topic, the need for a second style sheet will become apparent, as we're going to start to compartmentalize our different styles, such as global styles, component styles, and then also styles for different screen sizes. So appreciating the fact that later style sheets take priority is going to be important. So let's finish off by adding to our summary card, basic selectors and the cascade. We looked at the cascade. We saw that when we have the same selector, both targeting the same property, is known as conflicting styles. And conflicting styles declared later take priority. So in this case, the color green will be applied to the H1. We also saw what happened when we had two different style sheets, which both have the same selector. We have app.css, targeting an H1 of a font size of 12 pixels, and app2.css, which targets an H1 to have a font size of 52 pixels. In this case, we saw that style sheets defined later take priority. So in this case, the font size of the H1 will be 52 pixels, because conflicting styles in later style sheets take priority. Now we'll see how to apply styles to multiple elements at once by grouping selectors. We'll be discussing grouping shared styles, and grouping selectors and cascading. So what is grouping selectors about? Selectors can be comma-separated to apply shared styles. For example, let's say we had an H1 with the color blue and an H2 with the color blue. We can rewrite this CSS more efficiently like this. We grab the H1 selector and the H2 selector, and we comma-separate them. And then we just define our rule once. This method avoids us repeating shared styles and makes our CSS code more concise. So let's jump into VS Code and see how this works. So I've gone ahead and set up a new directory called grouping. Inside it, I have an index.html file where I've grabbed the boilerplate and added 3 headings, an H1, H2, and H3. I've then linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. So let's go and grab the H1. We'll give it a color of blue, a font weight of 700, letter spacing of -2 pixels, and font size of 40 pixels. I'm then just going to copy this, change the H1 to an H2, copy it again, and change the H2 to an H3. So we're effectively applying the same 4 rules to the H1, H2, and H3 separately. Let's check this out in the browser. Alright, so as you'd expect, these same rules have been applied to our H1, H2, and H3. As we saw before, we can more efficiently write this as H1, H2, H3, and remove these styles. And refresh the browser, and you'll see there's been no change. So these rules defined once are applying to these 3 different selectors. Now, for most projects you work on, there'll be some styles and are applied to all headings, like font weight and letter spacing. But other styles, like font size, will vary between headings. So how do we deal with that? We want to be able to define shared styles, but we also want to be able to define unique styles for elements that are grouped together. To do this, we're going to be using grouping selectors and cascading. We can use the CSS cascade to add new rules to previous rules. For example, the H1 and H2 here have the same color. The declaration is repeated, but the font size are unique. The H1 has a font size of 62 pixels, and the H2 has a font size of 48 pixels, where we have some shared styles and some unique styles. So this is how we handle it. We group together the shared styles. So here we have H1, H2 with the shared color property. And as a result, the property is defined once. We then add in the unique styling. So first, the H1, which has a font size of 62 pixels. And because of the nature of the cascade, this grey color is added to the H1. And we can do the same thing for the H2. We define the unique value for the font size, and again, because of the nature of the cascade, the grey color is effectively added to this H2. So we're using the cascade to our advantage here. We're adding new rules to previous rules. So the combination of grouping selectors and effectively using the cascade helps us write much cleaner and concise CSS. So let's jump back into VS Code and check this out in action. Alright, so I'm back in the app.css file we were working on before. In most projects, the heading font size is different. So let's remove that from our group styles. We'll add an H1. Let's give it a font size of 50 pixels. We'll add an H2. We'll give that a font size of 40 pixels. And finally the H3, which will give a font size of 30 pixels. I'll save the file and refresh the browser. So now you can see that these shared styles are being applied to our heading 1, 2, and 3, and we're using the cascade to handle the unique nature of the font size for each heading. This technique is very common and very effective for writing cleaner and simpler CSS.
Let's finish off this chapter by adding to our summary card basic selectors and the cascade.
We looked at grouping selectors. We saw that selectors are grouped when there's shared styles, like color for this H1 and H2. We would then add custom styling to our type selectors, like a font size for the H1, where we'd be using the cascade to add new styles to previous ones.
So let's go and add grouping selectors to our Quill project.
I'm inside our app.css of our Quill project. And the first thing I'm going to do is group our headings at the top here as they have a lot of shared styles. I'm then going to go grab all the shared styles between all the headings. Font weight's one of them. Line height. Letter spacing. Font family. And color. I'm now going to go delete these shared styles from each heading. So I can remove the font weight, the line height, letter spacing, font family, and color. And what I'm left with is the unique styling rules for the H1. And again, the way this works is we're using the cascade to our advantage, where the H1 will initially have all these styles, and then as we move down the sheet, these styles are added. Now to avoid boring you, I'm just going to go ahead and remove all the shared styles from all the headings. Alright, so let's see what we're left with. We're left with all our shared styles here, and then only a few rules defined on each heading. So all the repetitive properties have been removed, leaving us with much more concise and clean CSS code. I'm going to do the same thing for our paragraph and anchor tags, because there are a few shared styles there as well. The font weight is the same, the line height is the same, the font family is the same, and the color is also the same. So in the paragraph, I can remove those shared styles, and I'm just left with the font size of 20 pixels. In the anchor tag, I'm going to remove the font weight. We're going to keep text decoration because that is unique to the anchor tag. The line height I'll remove because that's shared. Font size is unique to the anchor tag, and these two properties are shared, so I can remove those. So once again, we've cleaned up our code. We have removed repeated styles, and our CSS code is more concise and clean. Now something you may be wondering is that even within our group selectors for paragraph and anchor tags, and all our headings, there are still shared styles here. For example, the font family is the same in our headings and our paragraph and anchor tags. Essentially, we want to apply the font family to every element.
And soon we will see how we can achieve that,
making our CSS code even more concise.
Moving on, we'll learn how to target specific elements more precisely using ID and class selectors.
We'll be discussing limitations with the type selector, the ID selector, and the class selector. So first up, let's discuss some limitations with type selectors. Sometimes we want to apply specific styles to a single element. For example, let's look at this homepage. You can see the paragraph text here is in white. And in this design, white paragraph text is only used on the hero section. Looking at a section of the page lower down, you can see over here that grey paragraph text is used everywhere else. So simply styling a paragraph grey wouldn't work. We need a method to style a specific element. And to do that, we use the ID selector. The ID selector selects an element based on a unique ID attribute and can only be used once. Let's say we have an index.html page, and we have this body with this paragraph text. You can see here the ID attribute. It has the value red-text. In the app.css file, we would have styles like this, where the color of all paragraphs is grey, but the paragraph with the ID value red text is set to red. The ID selector has this hash symbol in front of the value of the ID attribute in the HTML. So all we do is add an ID attribute to the element we want to target in our HTML, and then reference that value in CSS with the hash symbol followed by the value. Let's play around with this in VS Code. I'm back inside the index.html file for the Quill project we've been working on. I'm going to scroll down to the hero section, and let's go target this paragraph over here. We'll add an ID attribute, and let's make it green, so I'm going to give it the value of green text. Over in app.css, I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom. I'll grab the hash symbol. I'll then reference the ID attribute value, which is green text. Grab our curly brackets, and let's give it the color of green. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now that this paragraph is green, whereas all the other paragraphs still remain the grey color. By using the ID attribute, we're only targeting this paragraph here in the hero section. Let's now continue our discussion with limitations of the type selector. Sometimes we want to apply specific styles to multiple elements. So the ID selector can't help us here because the ID selector can only be used once on an element. For example, looking at this page here, you can see that there's grey text on the feature section. Scrolling down on the page, we can see here there's also grey text on the testimonial section. However, in other feature sections, we can see here that white text is used on the feature section. And on this section of the page, we have white text on the hero section. So in multiple places we have grey text, and in multiple places we have white text. So to help with this, we have the class selector. The class selector selects one or more elements based on a class attribute that can be used multiple times. Let's look at an example of this. Looking at the same index.html file we saw before, over here you can see I have the class attribute. I've given it the value blue-text, and I've used it twice. This is what makes the class attribute different to the ID attribute. It can be used multiple times. Having a look now at the app.css file, we select the class attribute with a full stop, or a period. And just like the ID attribute, we then provide the value that was used for the class attribute in our HTML, in this case blue-text. Let's have a play around with this in VS Code. I'm back in the index.html file, and I'm now going to select an element that I want to apply the style to in multiple places. Let's go do it on this h3 that we're using 3 times inside our features section. I'll add a class by typing class and hitting enter, and let's make this text orange. So we'll call it orange-text. I'm then going to copy the class and just paste it in this h3 and this h3. In app.css, to use the class selector, we type full stop or period and use the value of the class attribute, which we called orange-text. I'll grab our curly brackets, type color, and give it the value of orange. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can now see that our 3 h3s are all orange. We've targeted multiple elements and applied the same style, using the class selector. Whereas the ID selector only selected one element. So let's now discuss some selector guidance. Classes are often preferred over IDs because they offer greater flexibility and reusability. Let's have a look at an example. Let's say we had this index.html file, and we had this app.css file, targeting all paragraphs as grey, and then having a class called redText, which makes the text red. Initially in the project, we may just start with one. However, as the project grows, later on we can add another class of red text. So we can easily add styles as the project scales. So because classes can be applied once or multiple times, they offer a lot more flexibility. Let's now look at the next piece of guidance. It is common to use type selectors for global styles and class selectors for more specific visual styles. Taking a look at this page here, this heading would be styled using the type selector. It's a global style, meaning that all H1s throughout the application would be white, with this font size, etc. Whereas for more specific styles, we would use a class selector. For example, this gradient text here could be using the class gradient. So type selectors are useful for global styles, which are used throughout the application, whereas class selectors are useful for styling specific elements or components. So let's jump into Visual Code and check this out. So we've in fact already done this earlier. I created this class called orange text, and I applied this to the heading 3s on the page. This orange text is essentially overriding the default text applied to all headings, which we can see up here. But we have our grouped headings with this gray color being applied. So this style sets the default base color of all our headings. And then we can create a class like this called orange text and apply it to specific text elements we want to style. In this case, we added it to the H3 elements. And like in the example we saw just before, we could also style just a portion of text. So let's make a class called popText. Let's give it a color of red. Let's give it a font weight of 900. And let's add some text decoration of red, solid, and underline. Let's apply this popText to the word simplicity over here. I'll head to index.html. To do this, I need to add a span. I'll cut the word simplicity, pop it inside the span, and give this the class popText. Let's refresh the browser. And you can see, once again, this class popText is overriding the default text styling applied to our paragraphs, which we can see over here. We're adding a much thicker font weight of 900 versus 400. The color is being overridden to red, and we're also adding an underline. Now this next piece of guidance is a little bit more tricky, but we will go through it step by step, so just stick with me. Classes for components are designed to be combined on a single HTML element for a more modular approach to styling. Alright, so what does this all mean? First of all, the word components. A component is a piece of reusable UI, or user interface. It's a piece of UI we continue to use throughout the application. So let's take a look at an example of a classic piece of UI. Buttons. Buttons are used throughout the application, on the home page, login page, and within the application itself. Buttons are an example of a component or a piece of reusable UI that is used throughout the application. Now, as you can see here, we actually have two different kinds of buttons. We have this green button, which would likely be a primary button, and this white button, which would likely be a secondary button. The colors are different, but the core structure of the button is the same. It has the same rounding, it has the same font size. There's a lot of structural properties here that are the same. So let's now look at the best approach to creating this component in CSS with class selectors. We'd first define a class like this, which sets the button structure. Now, don't worry at all about any of the properties here. Most of them are box model properties you may have come across already. Just know for now, you need them to create the structure of a button, and you can learn more about the box model in my video in the description below. We would then add this button class to our anchor tag by using the HTML attribute class and giving it the value button btn. This would create the structure of our button. What we would then do is make a new class called button-primary. You can see it has this blue background color and white text. So the aim of this class is it sets a particular button style rule. We would then add this class in addition to the previous class to our anchor tag. So the styles are combined, and our class attribute is button btn and button primary. This would then give us our blue button with white text. And again, the structure of the button is from the btn class, whereas the specific styling of the background color and white text is from our btn-primary class. So this all seems a bit confusing just to give us a button. So let's now look at why this method is so powerful. Let's say in our application, like our quill application, we have a purple button. What we would then do is define a second class, which I'm calling button-secondary. I'm giving it a purple background color and the font color of white. For a hyperlink I want to be a purple button, I would then use this button secondary class. So I'm still referencing the button class to get the structure, but now I'm using the button secondary class to apply the specific styling I want of purple and white. And this would give me a button that looks like this. This method of combining styles like this is incredibly common, and it gives us a modular approach to styling, where we define the structure in one class and then specific styling rules in other classes that we simply add on inside the class attribute.
What we've just seen here is what we'll be implementing in our quill project.
This is in fact the approach many CSS frameworks like Bootstrap take. If I head over to Docs and scroll down to Components and go to Buttons, you can see that there's this base class, btn, and you can get all these different variants, which are simply added to the base class. For example, button primary, button secondary, etc. We're going to be writing our CSS using this modular approach. Don't worry about Bootstrap right now, I just wanted to show you that this method of combining classes like this is incredibly popular and is foundational to a lot of CSS frameworks.
So let's wrap up by finishing the summary card, basic selectors, and the cascade.
We looked at ID and class selectors. Inside the HTML, we can add the ID attribute, like ID red text, and the class attribute, like blue text. In CSS, we select the ID selector, like this, where we use the hash symbol followed by the same ID text used in the HTML attribute. And this would apply the color red to the text copper mug. And we saw that the ID attribute can only be used once. For the class selector, it looks like this, where we use a full stop or period followed by the value that's used in the HTML attribute. In this case, on the text biodiesel tattooed and coloring book. We saw that the class selector can be used multiple times. And because of this, it's more commonly used, as it allows our project to scale when we want to apply the same style across different HTML elements in the project.
So let's go ahead and apply some of the class guidance we just covered earlier.
So I'm starting off in our app.css file. I'm then going to create a new class with a full stop or period and call it small-text. I want to give it a font size of 12 pixels. Now the small text also has the same properties as the paragraph and anchor tag. A font weight of 400, line height of 1.5, Poppins family, and this grey color. So I'm just going to go group it up here as well. I'm going to type comma and then add the class small text. So in summary, I've created a small text class, which has a font size of 12 pixels and also shares the same styles with our paragraph and anchor tags. I now want to go add this class inside our HTML. I'll pop our CSS on the right here, so we can see the HTML on the left. I'm going to scroll down to the button, and inside this paragraph here, I'm going to add the class small text. So this text, made with love in London, will now be 12 pixels. So let's check this out in the browser. So if I scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see this text, made with love in London, is now a lot smaller. It's 12 pixels. Let's start creating our button components. I'm going to create a new class called btn. And like we saw earlier, this will be the structure of the button. There's only so much we can do for now, as we need to learn a bit more about the box model, which I cover in another video in the description below. But let's start adding the text properties we can. We'll give it a font weight of 400. The font family will be Poppins, with a backup of sans serif. We'll give it a font size of 16 pixels. And because this is used on an anchor tag, we're going to give it text decoration none. Let's now add the styles for the primary and secondary button. I'm going to define a new class, btn-primary, and we're going to give it our primary color, which I can easily grab from up the top here, the sky blue base primary color. We'll create the button secondary, btn-secondary, grab our curly brackets, grab the color property, and grab the base secondary color, which we called lavender. So next up, let's go and apply these classes inside our HTML. So I need to apply the primary button in a few locations. The first is in the register anchor tag. So I'll grab class, I'll type btn to grab the button structure, and then btn primary to grab the specific styling for the primary button. This same primary button is also used on the get started anchor link in the hero section. So I'll copy this class and paste it over here. We're then going to apply our secondary button in the call to action section on this hyperlink over here. So again, I'll grab the class attribute, I'll type btn to get the button structure, and then for the secondary button to apply that style, we type btn-secondary. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see nothing crazy has happened. All we have so far is the register and get started hyperlink in blue, and at the bottom of the page in the call to action section, the get started hyperlink over here has purple text. In the box model video, I add different styling to our button structure like padding to make these hyperlinks look a lot more like buttons. I don't want to do any box model properties in this video as I just want to focus on selectors, but you can check out the implementation of this in my box model video in the description below. Now, you may be wondering, why didn't I just get rid of this anchor tag? If I'm going to be applying the btn style to all our buttons, what's the point of still having this? Well, at the bottom of the page, we have these links here: home, login, and register. And these aren't styled like buttons. They're just navigation text. So we still need to keep this anchor style for navigation items like this. Whereas all the other anchor tags on our homepage, like get started here, learn more and get started, and login and register, will be styled like buttons. So we'll be using these styles here. But at the end of the day, we are still applying them to an anchor tag, which is why we need properties like text decoration none, and font size 16 pixels, which we decided in our style guide would be applied to anchor tags. So in a nutshell, these classes are styling anchor tags, which will look like buttons, and this type element is also styling an anchor tag. Now in theory, all these styles are actually defined in our CSS, because at the end of the day, the button class is being applied to an anchor tag. If we look at our anchor tag styling, we have text decoration none, font size 16 pixels, font size 16 pixels, and then up the top in our group selectors for our anchor tag, font weight 400 and font family Poppins and sans serif, which are these two over here. So at the moment, this class isn't actually doing anything new. However, for a component like a button, it is good practice to explicitly define these properties so you have easy reference in your CSS. And secondly, in the box model video, we will be adding new properties in here which don't currently exist in the CSS. So we definitely do need this btn structural class. But I did just want to highlight that currently it is actually doing nothing new, because all of these properties are already defined on our anchor tag over here and over here. All we're doing is using a class, btn, to override the default anchor tag styling. But it's just a bit funny at the moment because we're overriding it with its existing styles. But as I mentioned, we'll be adding new styles in the box model video in the description below. Next up, we'll dive into styling elements based on their state by using pseudo-classes. We'll be discussing what are pseudo-classes, state pseudo-classes, and conditional pseudo-classes. So what are pseudo-classes? Pseudo-classes define styles for a specific state or condition of an HTML element. So what do we mean by state or condition? Let's look at state first. An example of a state of an HTML element would be something like a button. At the moment, the button is green, but if I were to hover over this button, it turns purple. This is an example of state, where we can define styles for different states. Like we saw the button was green when our cursor was not hovering over it, whereas it turned purple when we did hover over it. Let's now look at condition. This would be something like in a table. We could style every odd row to be purple, like rows 1 and 3 here, and every even row to be white, like rows 2 and 4 here. We're using a condition of odd and even numbers to style the table. So let's now have a look at how we write pseudo-classes in CSS. A pseudo-class is a keyword with a colon added to the end of a selector. Let's have a look at an example of an anchor tag. We're using the type selector here, to select all anchor tags. We then add a colon and add the specific pseudo-class name, in this case hover. This combination of colon and pseudo-class name gives us a pseudo-class. So let's first take a look at the state pseudo-classes. These pseudo-classes are very important. So state pseudo-classes are about dynamic styling based on user interaction and commonly used for hyperlinks. Now I know the term pseudo-class can seem intimidating, but honestly, the most common use case for them is for hyperlinks, and we're going to be spending some time on it now. So don't freak out, just stick with me. There are 4 different pseudo-classes we can apply to our hyperlinks. The first is the link pseudo-class. This targets anchor tags that have not yet been visited. So in other words, it's simply an anchor tag you haven't clicked yet. The next pseudo-class is the visited pseudo-class. This targets anchor tags that have been visited. You've probably had an experience with this already, where oftentimes a link you've previously clicked on that you revisit will now be purple. This happens in Google searches all the time. So the visited pseudo-class will target anchor tags that you have visited, and the link pseudo-class targets anchor tags that haven't yet been clicked. Now these 2 pseudo-classes are specific to anchor tags. You can't use them anywhere else. The next pseudo-class is the hover pseudo-class. This targets an element when the cursor is placed over it. It's like what we saw in the start, how the button turned from green to purple. That would be using a hover pseudo-class. The last pseudo-class is the active pseudo-class. This targets an element when it is being clicked. So this pseudo-class is specifically targeting when the element is actually being clicked. Oftentimes, you won't even notice the active pseudo-class, because clicking an element might only last a few milliseconds. These 2 pseudo-classes are not specific to anchor tags. You can use them on other elements. So let's go play around with these in VS Code. So in VS Code, I've created a new folder called Pseudo-class. I've added an index.html with the HTML boilerplate, and I've linked a style sheet called app.css. In the index.html, let's go add an anchor tag. We'll give it the anchor text, click here. And for the href attribute, I'm just going to point it to Google's homepage. Jumping into the app.css file, we're going to style the anchor tag with those 4 different pseudo-classes. Let's first do the link pseudo-class. This pseudo-class was about when the anchor tag had not yet been visited. Let's give this a color of blue. Next up, we'll do the visited pseudo-class. This styles the anchor tag once it has been visited. Let's give it a color of red. The next pseudo-class was the hover pseudo-class. This will style the anchor tag when the cursor is placed over it. Let's give it a color of green. And the final pseudo-class was the active pseudo-class. And this targets the element when it is being clicked. Let's give this a color of yellow. Alright, let's go play around with this in the browser. Alright, I'm on the index.html file and I've zoomed in quite a bit, just so we can see what's going on. You can see straight away the hyperlink is blue. That's this style here. It's an anchor tag we have not yet clicked. If I now hover over it, you can see it turns green, and that's the hover pseudo-class coming into play. I'm now going to click on it, but I'm not going to let go of my mouse, because I want you to see the active pseudo-class in play. So right now, I'm holding my mouse down, but I'm not letting go. And you can see the active pseudo-class, yellow, is coming into play. I'm now going to let go, so it clicks the link. Okay, so we've now clicked the link. Let's head back to the page. So now you can see the link is no longer blue, it's red. And that's because I've clicked the link. So this pseudo-class is coming into play, visited. So let's now look at some state pseudo-class guidance. It is best practice to style the pseudo-classes of anchor tags instead of styling the anchor element directly. So let's have a look at what I mean by first looking at what is considered bad practice. Bad practice is simply using the type selector to select the anchor tag and apply styles directly. This is considered bad practice because we're not styling the different states the anchor tags can be. On the other hand, good practice is styling all the different pseudo-classes for the anchor tag. This approach covers all states. So our CSS would look something like this. We'd first style the linked and visited pseudo-class, for example, with the color blue. And you'll note these are actually grouped together, which is very common. It's because it isn't that common to separately style your visited pseudo-class. You usually want it to adopt the same styling as just the regular link. So that's why we group these together. We then add styling rules for the hover and active pseudo-classes. For example, we'll give it the color dark blue. And again, you'll notice these are grouped. And that's because we often don't really care about the subtlety of the active state, because in practice, you only see it for a few milliseconds when you click the link. So we just want to style it the same as the hover state, and that's why we group them together. This structure of styling the link and visited pseudo-classes together and the hover and active pseudo-classes together is incredibly common. And we take this same approach when styling a button class. For example, this would be considered bad practice, just styling the button, whereas this would be considered good practice, styling the button class pseudo-class of link, visited, hover, and active. Now, that can seem like a bit of a mouthful. We're targeting the pseudo-class of a class, but it is common and don't let it intimidate you. At the end of the day, our BTN class is targeting an anchor tag. So don't let the pseudo-class on a class thing throw you off. We're just targeting an anchor tag with the class name BTN.
We will be implementing this approach to pseudo-classes on our buttons in the Quill project. So stick with me and we'll soon see this in practice.
Let's have a quick look at conditional pseudo-classes. Conditional pseudo-classes are generally less important. I'm not really going to be using them throughout this video, but I just want to show you that they exist and how they work. Conditional pseudo-classes are styling based on an element's position in relation to other elements. For example, we could have the pseudo-class firstChild, which targets the first child element in a list. We have the lastChild pseudo-class, which targets the last child element. And there's also the nth-child pseudo-class, which targets child elements based on their position. In this case, every nth child. Now, some common places you may see conditional pseudo-classes include on lists, like I've done here, or in tables, where you'd be targeting the tr element, the table row. For example, to get alternating colors for table rows, which helps with table readability. Let's jump into VS Code and play around with these conditional pseudo-classes. I'm back in the pseudo-class folder over here, and I've cleared out the index.html file and our app.css file from when we were playing around with state pseudo-classes. In index.html, I'm going to go add an unordered list. I'm going to create 6 list items by typing li times 6, and I'm just going to give each list item a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Jumping over to our app.css file, let's grab a list item and select the firstChild pseudo-class, and let's make it the color red. So this will style our first list item red. Let's then grab the list element again and add the lastChild pseudo-class. Let's give this a color of blue. Let's check this out in the browser. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in a bit so we can see this more clearly. You can see that our first list item is now red, and our last list item is blue. So if I now were to go add another list item, let's say the number 7, you'll see that the blue color is now applied to 7. It's always targeting the last child of the list. And the same thing here, if I go add the number 0 and refresh, you'll see that the first child is always targeting the first list item, which is now 0. I'm going to remove these styles. Let's now play around with the nth-child pseudo-class. The way this works is we need to specify something inside these brackets. For now, I'm just going to pick the number 3, and this will simply target the third element. Let's go and give that a color of green, and I'll refresh the browser, and you'll see the third list item, which is now number 2, is green. But we can use this as a bit of a formula, where, for example, I can put 2n, which will target every second list item as green. So if I refresh, you'll see 1, 3, 5, and 7, which is every second list item is now green. In other words, I'm targeting even list items. I can target odd elements by simply adding a +1 here, so that when n is 0, 2 times 0 is 0 plus 1, so the first item will be green. When n is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3, so every third item will be green. When n is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5, so every fifth item will be green, etc. So if I refresh, so you'll now see that every odd list item, starting here, is styled green. And not that you'd ever need to do this, but you can start making up your own linear equations in here. For example, I could do 3n plus 2. So if I refresh, when n is 0, we get 3 times 0 plus 2. So the second list item is styled. When n is 1, 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 is 5. So the fifth list item is green. Anyways, I just wanted to show you these conditional pseudo-classes. Don't let them freak you out. We're not really going to be using them at all. The state pseudo-classes on our anchor tags are way more important.
So let's finish off by starting to build the next summary card, pseudo-classes and specificity.
We looked at pseudo-classes. A pseudo-class works by having a selector, like the anchor tag, and following it with a colon and a pseudo-class name, like hover. This gives us a pseudo-class. We saw that there were two different types of pseudo-classes. There was a state pseudo-class, which is very important, and this is where styling is based on user interaction. And we saw a common use case was targeting anchor tags, like buttons, where we would often group the link and visited pseudo-classes, as well as group the hover and active pseudo-classes. We then also looked at conditional pseudo-classes, and these were less important, as we don't use them as often as state pseudo-classes. Conditional pseudo-classes is when styling is based on an element's relative position. And we saw an example of an nth child pseudo-class, and can be used to target every odd or even list row.
So let's go and add pseudo-classes to our Quill project.
Now, the first thing we need to talk about is where exactly are we going to add these pseudo-classes? We actually don't need to add the pseudo-classes onto this button class here. And that's because it's setting up the overall structure of the button. We only really care about the state changes of the button, like when you're hovering or when it's visited, for the actual specific button styles. So button primary and button secondary. So let's do the first group of pseudo-classes. We'll do button primary and add the pseudo-class link, which again targets anchor tags that have not yet been visited. And we're going to be grouping that with button primary and the pseudo-class visited, which as a reminder, targets anchor tags that have been visited. We'll grab our curly bracket and we'll just give this the same color as before. And I'm now going to get rid of this style here, as we don't need it anymore, as we're now implementing better practice, targeting all four states of our button. We'll then add the next group of pseudo-classes. So we'll grab our class, btn-primary, and the pseudo-class hover, which as a reminder, targets the anchor tag when the cursor is hovering over it. And we'll group this with button primary and the active pseudo-class, which as a reminder, targets an element when it is being clicked. We'll grab our curly brackets, and let's now add a darker color of this blue. We'll scroll up to the UI guide we created at the top. And let's add our primary shade, this deep sea color here. And we'll go ahead and implement this exact same method for our secondary button. We'll grab our secondary button, add the link pseudo-class, grab the secondary button and add the visited pseudo-class, grab curly brackets, and we'll use the same color here. We'll then get rid of this as we no longer need it. We'll then add the other group of pseudo-classes. We'll grab button secondary, add the hover pseudo-class, get button secondary again, and grab the active pseudo-class. For the color here, let's go grab a shade of this purple. Scrolling up to the top, this purple is lavender. It's our secondary base color. For the shade, we called it Velvet Night. And it has this hex code here. So I'll simply copy that and paste it here as the color value. So let's now check this out in the browser. So our get started anchor tag here has the btn primary style applied to it. Just as a reminder, if I head to index.html, you can see here, this anchor tag has the class btn and btn primary. So with our pseudo classes, we've now targeted this primary button and considered all the different states. At the moment, the get started button is this blue here, because it's a link which hasn't yet been clicked. If I hover over it, you'll notice that it goes a darker blue. And that's this pseudo class coming into play. The hover pseudo class is making it this slightly darker blue. I'm now going to click on it but hold my mouse to show you the active pseudo class. I am holding my mouse and you won't actually notice a change in color, and that's because the hover pseudo class is grouped together with our active pseudo class. It's the same darker blue. I'm now going to let go of my mouse so that the anchor tag is clicked, which takes me to the register page. I'm just going to head back, and the Get Started hyperlink is still our primary base blue. That is this blue over here. It hasn't changed color because the visited pseudo class is the same as the link pseudo class. And the exact same thing would happen down here, on this Get Started button here. As a reminder, we've added the btn secondary class there. Looking in the index.html, scrolling down to the CTA section, you can see btn and btn secondary. So the exact same thing is going to happen now. The hyperlink text is our base purple, whether it's been visited or not. And when I hover and click, it's going to go to that darker shade of purple, which you can see now. Now, just to clarify again, why we're adding our pseudo classes over here and not to the btn class over here, is that because the state changes that we're going to be coding are only happening on our primary and secondary. There are no changes in state to any of these properties. It's not like when I hover over the button, I'm changing the font or changing the font size. These properties are static. They remain constant no matter what the state is. However, for the specific styling like primary and secondary buttons, we do want to consider state. We want to make our buttons one color in this state and another color in this state. And in the CSS box model video, we add even more properties in here. Things like background color, which will really make these two groups of pseudo classes even more prominent. Now, one last thing I want to show you before we finish up is I could take a similar approach with this anchor tag here. I could add in pseudo classes just like we did for the link and visited state, as well as the hover and active state. Those styles would be visible down here in this mini navigation bar in our footer. So for example, we could style the anchor tag that when I hover on it, it goes a little bit darker. Now, I'm not going to do that because I want to keep this a bit simpler for now. That style really is not critical for the visual aesthetic of this web page. But for buttons, it is. You always want to be using pseudo classes on your buttons like I've done here. Let's continue by exploring to select elements based on their relationship with other elements using Combinator Selectors. We'll be talking about the descendant selector, the direct descendant selector, the adjacent sibling selector, and the general sibling selector. So what are Combinator Selectors? Combinator Selectors combines two or more selectors to target elements based on their position relative to each other. Now, I do want to give a bit of a heads up at this point. The Combinator Selectors we're going to look at are just not that commonly used in CSS. This chapter may seem overwhelming going through each of these selectors, but I honestly wouldn't worry about it too much. It's something you just need to know about and probably aren't going to be using them that much in practice. There's four main types of Combinator Selectors. The first is called the descendant or child selector and looks like this. And this selector I do sometimes use. It's definitely the more commonly used one compared to the others we'll look at. The next Combinator Selector is the direct descendant or child selector and looks like this. The next one is the adjacent sibling selector, which looks like this. And the last one is the general sibling selector, which looks like this. Now, these three I don't really use, and they're not overly common. So as you can see, each of these selectors is combining two selectors, and we're going to go through each one now to see how they work. We'll start off with the descendant selector. This targets all children elements of a parent. We have a selector, then a space, followed by another selector. In this case, div space p. Let's have a look at a snippet of HTML to see how this works. This HTML is a short article of my favorite Will Smith movies. We've got a containing div element with the class of article, and inside the div we have an h1, 2 paragraphs, and then another div which contains an unordered list and a paragraph. So let's look at a CSS rule and see the descendant selector in action. This first class, article, we would call the parent, and the paragraph type selector is the child. So inside our HTML, the class article is on this div, which is the parent, and the paragraph here and here are what we call direct children. They're direct children of the parent. We also have a paragraph down the bottom here inside the nested div. This would be considered a grandchild. Now, the descendant selector targets all children element of the parent, so all 3 paragraphs here would be blue. Now, just a small note, we can use any type of selectors. In the example I showed you, we used a class selector, which was the parent, followed by a type selector, which was the child. But we can use any selectors. For example, we could achieve the same thing by 2 type selectives, div, which would be the parent, and the paragraph type selector, which again would be the child. So you can use any selector types. The important thing to note is that the first selector you choose is the parent, followed by a space, followed by the second selector, which will be the child. So let's have a play around with this in VS Code. I've prepared a new file, index.html, which contains the HTML snippet we just saw before, an article containing my favorite Will Smith movies. I've also linked a style sheet, which is currently empty. So let's go use the descendant selector. I'll first use the class article, which is the parent element, space, and then paragraph for my child element. Let's give it the color green and a font size of 30 pixels. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that all paragraphs, whether they're a child, grandchild, etc., of the parent container are all green. We know that these 2 paragraphs were direct children, which are over here in our HTML, and this paragraph was a grandchild. It's the child of a child, but the descendant selector selects all children. Next up is the direct descendant selector. This targets only direct children elements of a parent. And the syntax looks like this, where instead of a space, we have a right angle bracket. So looking at some CSS now, we'd write a rule very similar to before, but instead of a space, we now have a right angle bracket. The class article, again, is the parent, and the paragraph type selector is the child. Now, the direct descendant selector, like its name suggests, only targets direct descendants. So this paragraph down here is a grandchild, which is not selected. So only the direct children, shown in green, would be colored blue. Let's play around with this in VS Code. Back inside our app.css file, I'm going to change the descendant selector to a direct descendant selector by using the right angle bracket. And I'll just keep these styles the same. Let's check this out in the browser. So now you can see only these 2 paragraphs are being styled. And this paragraph down here is not being styled because it's not a direct descendant. It's what we would call a grandchild. Next up is the adjacent sibling selector. Adjacent is just a fancy word for next to. The adjacent sibling selector targets an element directly after another element, both nested within the same parent. The syntax looks like this, where the parent and child are now separated by a plus symbol. Now, the sentence I read out before is a bit of a mouthful, so let's see what this actually means. Inside our CSS, we could have a rule like this, where we have 2 selectors separated by a plus. The first selector we call the preceding sibling, i.e. the sibling before. And the second selector we call the adjacent sibling, that is, the sibling next to. So I'm going to read out the sentence again. Targets an element directly after another element, both nested within the same parent. Let's start with both nested within the same parent. That would be something like this div element here. It's a shared parent of nested elements. Now in our CSS, the first selector is the h1, which is the preceding selector. In our markup, the h1 is over here. So this is the preceding sibling. And the adjacent sibling is the element directly after the preceding sibling. So it's just this paragraph here. It's the adjacent sibling. So the important part here is that the 2 elements we're selecting, the h1 and paragraph, need to be nested within the same parent, in this case the div. And because they're on the same level, they're considered siblings. Where we first select the preceding sibling, it's kind of like the root sibling. It's our reference point. And the next selector is the adjacent sibling, and it's specifically targeting the element directly after the preceding sibling. So that's why only the first paragraph is selected, and not the paragraph below it. Let's play around with this in VS Code. So I'm going to get rid of the style from before. I'll grab the h1 plus the paragraph and our curly brackets. And for this style, let's just give it a color of red. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see here the adjacent sibling which is the paragraph, has been colored red. Like I mentioned, see the H1 as like a reference point, which is over here in our markup. The adjacent sibling selector targets the element directly after this reference point, this paragraph here. And again, for this to work, they have to be considered siblings, which means they need a shared parent, which in this case is this div over here. The last combinator selector we're going to look at is the general sibling selector. This targets multiple elements directly after another element, both nested within the same parent. And the syntax looks like this, where we have two selectors separated by a tilde symbol. So let's have a look at this inside CSS. I'm going to define this rule here. The H1 is again considered the preceding sibling, and the paragraph is now referred to as subsequent siblings. The general sibling selector is pretty similar to the adjacent sibling selector. In addition to selecting direct siblings, it will select multiple siblings that are nested within the same parent. So this paragraph over here is also selected. The first and second paragraph are both subsequent siblings of the heading. The paragraph down here is not a sibling of the heading, so won't be selected. Let's look at this inside VS Code. So all I'm going to do is remove the plus symbol and replace it with a tilde, and I'll keep the style the same. So let's check it out in the browser. So you can see now, both this paragraph and this paragraph are styled red, whereas before, with the adjacent sibling selector, only this paragraph was styled red. And we can also see that this paragraph is not styled. Now, all these combinator selectors are pretty intimidating. As I mentioned, don't really worry about them. And besides the descendant selector, which is definitely the easiest one to understand, I'm not really going to be using these throughout this video, but I just want you to know about them in case you see them out there in the wild.
So let's wrap up by adding to our summary card pseudo-classes and specificity.
We looked at combinator selectors. We saw there were 4 different kinds of combinator selectors. We had the descendant selector, where we use 2 selectors separated by a space. We had the direct descendant selector, where we have 2 selectors separated by a right angle bracket. We have the adjacent sibling selector, where we have 2 selectors separated by a plus symbol.
And we had the general sibling selector,
where we have 2 selectors separated by a tilde symbol. As I've mentioned a few times now, I know these combinator selectors are quite overwhelming, and the good news is we don't really use them. So I wouldn't worry too much about them. I would just remember what the descendant selector does, as you will sometimes want to use that.
Now it's time to look at how CSS determines which styles take precedence through the concept of specificity. We'll be discussing the cascade and conflicting selectors, specificity, and specificity calculations. Before we look at specificity, let's do a quick recap of the cascade. The cascade is about how styles declared later will take priority when the selectors are the same. For example, looking at this snippet of HTML, we have an H1. In CSS, we could style the selector by using the type selector to grab the H1 and then give it a color of blue. Later on in the sheet, we can grab the H1 again using the type selector. So in this example, we're using the same selector, the H1 type selector. And we know because of the cascading nature of CSS, styles declared later will take priority. So in this case, green overrides blue. So the H1 will no longer be styled blue, it will be styled green. Let's now talk about what happens when we have conflicting selectors. When styles are applied to the same element using a different type of selector, the outcome is determined by specificity. So what do we mean by this? Let's say we had the same HTML we saw before, but now we've added a class attribute with the value heading. Now in the CSS, we're going to style this heading in 2 different ways. The first is using the class heading, where we have the notation period or full stop, followed by heading. And the second is using the type selector H1. So now in this case, we have different selectors, a class selector and a type selector, but they're both targeting the same H1 element. And not only are they targeting the same element, they're applying conflicting styles. The class selector is styling the heading to be blue, whereas the type selector is styling the heading to be green. Now up until this point, you would say to me that because the type selector H1 with the color green is declared after the class selector, the color of the heading will be green, because we know the nature of the cascade is that styles declared later will take priority. However, this is not the case. The green does not override the blue. And this is where specificity comes into play. Now, to understand specificity, we're going to be looking at sports tables. In a sports table, team rankings are determined using a system of priority. I'm going to be looking at the English Premier League. Currently, Arsenal is in first place, Man City in second place, and Liverpool in third place. The rankings of the teams are determined by things like wins, draws, and goal difference, where as we move from the left to the right, the numbers have a lower priority, where as we know a win is more substantial than a draw, and a draw is more substantial than goal difference. We can see Arsenal has 7 wins. This puts them in first place as they have the most wins. Looking now at Man City and Liverpool, they both have the same number of wins, 5 each, and they also have the same number of draws, 4 each. So the place in the table is determined by goal difference. Man City has 20, and Liverpool has 8. So Man City is in second place as they're ahead on goal difference. Now, if you were to just look at the numbers on this table, 20 is the largest. It's the value of Man City's goal difference. Now, this is the largest number, but it's also the lowest priority. As I mentioned at the start, a win is much more substantial than a goal difference. So as a team in the EPL, it's a lot more important to have 1 win over, say, 100 goal difference. The category of win, draw, and goal difference is really important and have a lower priority as we move from left to right. This same principle applies to specificity. So what is specificity? Specificity determines the priority of a CSS rule when multiple rules apply to the same element. Let's have a look at this snippet of HTML. We have an h1 nested inside a div, which is then nested inside another div. In our CSS, we have 4 different ways of selecting the same element. The first rule is using the ID selector. The second rule is using the descendant selector, where the class textbox is the parent and the class large is the child. The third rule is also using the descendant selector, where we're first selecting the div as the parent using the type selector, then selecting the next div down as the child using the type selector, and then using the class large, which is the grandchild, to select the heading. And the fourth rule again uses the descendant selector, but instead of using the class large to select the heading, we're using the type selector h1. So all these CSS rules are selecting the same element, the h1, but they're using a mix of different selectors, and they're all trying to apply a different color. So which color ends up being applied? To do that, we need to do a specificity calculation. A specificity calculation is very similar in nature to the sports table, where instead of wins, draws, and goal differences, we have the type of selector, ID, class and pseudo-class, and type. Where as we move from left to right, these selectors have a lower priority. So an ID selector is like a win, a class and pseudo-class selector is like a draw, and a type selector is like a goal difference. So let's now go through all 4 CSS rules we just saw earlier and tally this up. The first selector was the ID selector heading. There's just one ID selector here, so this gets 1 point. There's no class or pseudo-class selector, and there's no type selector. The next rule we saw was the descendant selector using 2 classes. There are no IDs here, so this gets 0. And there are 2 class selectors here, textbox and large, so this gets 2 points. And there are no type selectors, so we get 0 points. The next CSS rule looked like this. There are no ID selectors, so this gets 0 points. There is 1 class selector being used, large, so this gets 1 point. And there are 2 type selectors, the 2 divs, so this gets 2 points. The last rule looked like this. In this case, there are no IDs being used, so the ID column gets 0. There are no class and pseudo-classes being used, so we give 0 here. And there are 3 type selectors being used, div, div, and h1. So the type column gets 3 points. So the ID selector heading is at the top of the table. Back to the football analogy, it's like it has 1 win, whereas all the other selector combinations don't have any wins. And we say that this selector has the highest specificity. In other words, it's the most specific selector used. And you can see each row is ordered correctly in terms of its specificity. For example, the next row down, where we have the two classes text box and large, this uses two classes, which is like two drawers. So that's a higher specificity of the combination below it, the div, and large class, where that only has one class and two type selectors. And once again, if you look at this table, the largest number on it is 3, which are 3 type selectors on the div, and h1. But the biggest number doesn't matter, because the type is like goal difference. It isn't such an important number compared to an ID, which is like a win. So let's finish up by talking about some specificity guidance. Long story short, don't worry too much about it. The concept of specificity and the calculations behind it can seem a bit confusing. I can assure you, you're not going to be sitting there with a calculator trying to work out its specificity value whenever you're applying a CSS rule. Specificity is just something you need to know about so that you understand when you're applying conflicting selectors, which one is winning and why. The reason I don't want you to worry too much about it is because it is common to use the type selector for global styles and the class selector to override this for specific styling. For example, on this page, the heading 2 over here would be a global style with a specific font weight, color, font size, etc. So by default, within our application, all H2s will be styled this way. Within the application, there may be specific circumstances we want to override that default global styling. For example, this H2 over here, we could create a class called white, where we would override the H2 color property with a white color using the class. And the reason this works is because a class selector is more specific than a type selector. So long story short, don't stress about specificity. We're generally going to be styling global styles using type selectors and using class selectors to override this style for specific cases. It is also important to understand the concept of specificity so that when you write your own CSS and rules aren't being applied as you'd expect, you can start thinking about the specificity of conflicting selectors. So let's complete the summary card, pseudo-classes and specificity. We looked at specificity. We saw that specificity determines priority of a CSS rule when multiple conflicting rules are applied to the same element. We looked at an example of HTML like this, where we were targeting the H1 in 4 different ways. We saw that we could calculate the specificity of each selector, where ID, class and pseudo-class, and type selectors had a lower priority from left to right. In the example, we looked at 4 different cases, where filling in the table, the heading was 1, 0, 0, the 2 class selectors was 0, 2, 0, the 2 type selectors and class was 0, 1, 2, and the 3 type selectors was 0, 0, 3. And therefore the heading, which is an ID class, had the highest specificity, as any ID selectors were much more specific than a class or pseudo-class or type selector, just like a goal was more important than a draw. The guidance we saw was that we use the type selector for global styles and class selector to override for specific styling. It's now time to learn a fundamental concept in CSS, where certain styles can be passed down from parent element to child elements through inheritance.
We'll be discussing what is inheritance and specificity, what gets inherited, and inheritance and text align.
So this chapter is getting my more difficult stamp.
The concepts we're going to be exploring are just a little bit more challenging,
especially towards the end of the chapter when we talk about inheritance and text align.
So what is CSS inheritance? It's when properties set on parent elements are passed down to their children by default. Let's take a look at an example to see what I mean. We have this snippet of HTML where we have a div container element with the class hero section, and it contains a heading 1 and paragraph element. Looking now at the CSS, we've added the CSS rule color blue to the hero section. Now this rule is set on a parent. So what happens here is the parent element passes down this styling to its children. So the H1 and paragraph get this blue color. And we say the blue color is inherited. So that's the basic idea of inheritance. Properties set on parent elements will be passed down to their children. And now quickly want to touch on inheritance and specificity. Specific selectors will override inherited styles, as inherited styles have a very low specificity. I'm going to update our CSS to now include this rule, where we're styling our paragraph red. We're using the type selector here, which has a higher specificity compared to inherited styles, meaning our rule above, where we're adding the color blue to the container and it's being passed down to the heading, is a very low specificity. So almost any time we're using a specific selector, like a type, class, or ID selector, to target a specific element, it will always override inherited styles. So in our paragraph, the red color is applied, as it's overriding the blue color applied on the div, which is being inherited by the paragraph. Let's see this in action inside DevTools on the monday.com homepage. I'm going to right-click, Inspect to open up the DevTools, and I'm just going to select this text over here. We can see the styles that have been applied directly to this element here. It's got a font weight of 600, font size 60 pixels, and a line height of 100%. If we scroll down, we can see over here inherited from. This color is being inherited from somewhere else. If I scroll down more, you can see that the text align center is also being inherited. Now I want to show you an example of what I was talking about earlier. How applying styles directly on the element will always override conflicting inherited styles. You can see here, for example, the font size is being set to 60 pixels directly on the element. If I scroll down here and have a look at inherited from body, which is the body tag, the font size 16 pixels has been crossed out. It's because, as I mentioned earlier, applying styles with inheritance has a very low specificity. So when we have conflicting styles, one which is being inherited versus one which is being applied directly, the one which is being applied directly will always win out. And that's why we end up with a font size of 60 pixels. So the next question I want to answer is what gets inherited? It is mainly text properties that are inherited from parent to child.
So properties like these.
I'm not going to read them out, but feel free to pause to have a look at them. This is really important to remember. It's mainly text properties that are inherited. So try your best to remember that fact, because it can sometimes be confusing when you're applying a property to a parent and you're wondering why it isn't being inherited. More often than not, you're applying a non-text property. So by way of example, let's say we have the same HTML snippet we saw before, and we now apply these two styles to the div, a color blue and a border that's 5 pixels solid and black. Now, border is a box model property I discuss in great length in my box model video that you can check out in the description below. Because border is a non-text property, it's not going to be inherited by the children. So only the color blue will be passed down to the heading and paragraph. So let's go play around with inheritance inside VS Code. I've created a new mini project where I have an index.html file with the boilerplate ready. I've added in a link element, which links to an empty style sheet app.css. Alright, inside the body, let's go add a container element with some div tags. I'm then going to add in an h1, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. I'm just going to give this div a class of hero-section. Heading over to app.css, let's select this class, and we'll give it a few text properties. Font size of 30 pixels, the color blue, and let's make it all uppercase with text transform uppercase. Let's check this out in the browser. So let's look at what we see here. I'm going to start with the paragraph. This element has inherited everything from the container. The color is blue and it's all uppercase. Now for the anchor tag, the font size is 30 pixels and it's all uppercase, but it isn't blue. And the reason is because the browser has built-in styles that are applied directly to the element.
We saw this in the Pseudo-classes chapter where we can style the pseudo-class visited.
Because I have visited google.com, the default styling of the visited pseudo-class in the browser is purple. So that default style will override the inherited style, which we know has a very low specificity. And the same thing's happening on the heading here. The heading is inheriting the blue color and text transform uppercase, but the font size is bigger than 30 pixels. And we can actually see this default browser styling inside DevTools. If I go to Inspect and click on the heading, you can see over here the H1 have these default styles that are set directly on it inside the browser. One of them is font size 2M. And you can see my styling, which I'm setting on the parent and is being inherited, is being crossed out. And because there's no default styling for color or text transform, they are being applied. But we have conflicting rules for font size set directly on the H1 for the default styling in the browser, And for the font size, I'm setting on the parent, which is being inherited. And as we know, inheritance has a very low specificity, so the default font size of 2Ms will win. Now, in practice, don't let this freak you out too much, because it's very rare we're actually going to be using the default styles inside the browser. Like we've seen in our Quill project already, we are explicitly styling the H1 in our CSS. So in almost all cases, we're always going to override the default browser styling with our own styles. And this brings me to the important topic of inheritance guidance. Make sure you marry a rich partner. That's good advice for the real world. But in CSS, global font styles are set on the body element so that all child text elements inherit styles by default. Let's have a look at an example of what I mean with this snippet of HTML. I've got a section container, which has inside a heading and paragraph, and then I've got a footer with a single paragraph. Inside the CSS, we would select the body element, which we know is the main wrapper element inside the HTML file for all content displayed on the page. We would set default text properties here, like the color, font weight, and font family. All these text properties are then inherited. Now, a property like font size would not be set here, because usually every text element, like a heading 1, heading 2, paragraph, etc., has its own distinct font size. Whereas setting something like a color is a good idea. It gives us a base color for all our text elements, and then anytime we need a specific color, we can just override it with specific styling rules.
We will be using this method in our Quill project.
Once we've done that, we next want to set global font styles on type selectors, which will override inherited properties. I'm going to make some more space in our CSS file here, and I'm going to add this H1. The properties defined in the body are still being inherited, and any newly defined conflicting styles, like color and font weight, will override the inherited styles. So the H1 will now have a color of blue, a font weight of 700. The font family will still be Arial, which is inherited from the body, as there's no conflicting style there. And the font size, which is a newly defined property, will be 52 pixels. Setting default text properties on the body element is very, very common. But inheritance is also often utilized for a container that requires specific text styling. In the HTML snippet we have on the left here, I'm going to simply add a class to the section with the value hero section. I'm then going to update our CSS, where I'm targeting the hero section and adding a text transform property. So this style is applied on the container. So we end up with our heading 1, which will result in uppercase on both heading and paragraph elements. So it's very common to use inheritance both to set default text styles on the body, as well as use inheritance within particular sections of the page. So the last thing I want to focus on is inheritance and the text align property, as this can cause a lot of confusion. We've already seen text align affects block level elements, but has no impact on inline level elements. I covered at great length in my CSS text video, which you can check out in the description below. But just as a quick recap, let's say I have a page with a heading 1 and a paragraph. Headings and paragraphs are block elements, which means they take up the full width of the page. If we were to apply text align center onto the heading and paragraph, the content inside the box gets centered. So our text will display like this. And this is because there's space to move within the box of the heading and paragraph. Let's compare this behavior to the anchor tag. An anchor tag is an inline element, which means it only takes up the width of the content and doesn't extend the full width of the page. So if we were to apply text align to the anchor tag, there is no space to center the text. So the anchor tag doesn't move. Jumping back into VS Code with the file we were playing around with earlier, I've got a heading 1, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. I'm going to head over to app.css and just remove these styles. The heading 1, I'll grab text align and set the value to center. For the paragraph, I'll do the same thing. And for the anchor tag, I'm also going to set text align to center. So let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, our block level elements, the heading and paragraph, get centered, whereas there's no impact on the anchor tag. And we can see why visually when I go to DevTools. When I click on the heading, you can see the blue box, which is the space the heading can move. The same for the paragraph tag. Whereas when I hover over the anchor tag, The blue box is just the content itself. There's no space for it to move. So now I want to show you something which will blow your mind. I'm going to remove these styles, and now I'm going to add text-align onto the parent container, this div here. I'll add the class hero section, and I'll put text-align as center. I'm going to refresh the page and watch what happens. Both the block and inline elements are being centered. So what is happening here? So we've just seen that when applying the text-align property to a block-level parent containing inline elements, all children will be impacted. So in the example we just looked at, we had a block-level parent, which is a div. And as a quick reminder, a div is a block-line element. And we applied text-align center to this, which ended up centering the block elements and the inline elements. So there's actually two things going on here. The first is that child elements are centered, where the child elements here are the heading 1, paragraph, and anchor tag. To really highlight this point, I kind of want to move away from these elements. I'm going to fill in the block elements like this, and I'm going to fill in the inline element like this. Now for the block elements, there is no impact on block elements as the element is already full width. I want us to view these elements as children, rather than specific H1, paragraph, etc. elements. Just view it as a red box. Because the red box is a block element, it takes up the full width. So this child cannot move anywhere inside the div. In contrast, the inline element is centered as it has space to move. Again, just view it as a green box inside this div element. And because text-align center is set on the div, which means all child elements of the div are centered, the inline element will be centered, and it has space to move because the inline element only takes up the width of the content itself. So that's the first thing going on. Child elements are centered, and the major impact here is on inline elements, which end up being centered. And there's actually no impact on block elements. Now, something else I want to quickly mention before we move on is that this in fact can be any inline element. For example, if we had an image that was this size, it would also be centered. So that's why I took this approach of coloring it in green. I just want you to see it as a green box. It doesn't really matter what inline element it is. From the div's perspective, it just sees it as a general child. So let's now have a look at the second thing going on. The second thing happening is that child elements inherit the text-align property. And again, inheritance is when we're passing on the property from parent to child. It's like the H1 and paragraph now have text-align applied directly to them through inheritance. And this is just now the standard behavior we've seen before, where text is centered inside block elements as there's space to move. So the second thing that would happen is our text inside our block elements, H1 and paragraph, will center. And there's no impact on inline elements as text has no space to move. Again, this is just a regular behavior we've always seen. When you try to apply text-align center onto an anchor tag, it won't move. And in this case, the text-align center property has been inherited from the parent div. So the net effect from these two different things going on is that both the block elements and the inline element are centered. Now, at the end of the day, you just need to remember that when you apply the text-align property onto a block-level container like a div, everything inside it will get centered. I spent a bit of time explaining what's going on behind the scenes because I think it is useful you have a basic understanding. So let's finish off by building our next summary card, Inheritance and the Universal Selector. We looked at inheritance, which is where properties set on parent elements are passed to child elements by default. And we saw this was mainly for text properties. We saw an example with a snippet of HTML like this, and we applied CSS styling rules onto the body. And we saw that all the text properties were inherited by all the HTML elements wrapped by the body tag. For inheritance guidance, we said global font styles are set on the body element. We also looked at inheritance and text-align. We saw that when applying text-align to a block-level parent, both block and inline elements are impacted. We looked at an example where we had a div, and we applied the text-align property to this div container. We had an H1 and paragraph, which are both block elements, and block elements inherit the text-align property. This causes them to center inside their box. We saw an anchor tag, which is an inline element. And inline elements have space to move inside the block container, which results in the anchor tag being centered. So applying text align to a container results in both block and inline elements being centered, just through different mechanisms.
So let's now go and use inheritance inside our quill project.
I'm going to go grab the body, add our curly brackets, and let's start adding in our global font styles. The first one I'm going to put in here is the font family. I'm just going to copy it from here and paste it in the body. Now, because I'm defining it on the body, which means that all child text elements will inherit this, I'm now actually going to remove it from any other location we're defining this to avoid duplicate declarations. So I'm going to remove it from here, and we also have it on our paragraph anchor and small text. And I also have it down here on our BTN class. So I'm going to go remove it over here as well.
Now, previously in this topic,
I did speak about explicitly defining some properties on the BTN class, so it's clear the properties being used in our buttons. However, now that we've learnt about inheritance, the best practice is we define our global base font styles on the body. So something like font family is just applied to every single property. So there's no need to explicitly define font family on the button as well. So in doing this, we've now consolidated our font family property onto the body, which is being applied to all text properties through inheritance. The other properties I'm going to be adding, I'm going to go grab down here. I'm going to copy these and paste them inside our body. Now, the reason I'm selecting a font weight of 400, a line height of 1.5, and our base gray color is because those are the default text properties I want. As we've seen, they're used on elements like paragraphs, anchor tags, smaller text, etc. I kind of see these elements as a bit more commonly used throughout the application, whereas headings are a bit more specialist. So that's why I want to use these properties as my default properties. So I'm going to scroll back down here and simply remove this now. Now I could also remove the font weight of 400 in our button class, because that's now set on our body tag. And through inheritance, our anchor tag will get applied the style. However, with a component like a button, it actually is still good practice to keep the font weight explicitly defined here. That's because something like a font weight on a button could be different. You could have a 500, 600, or 700 value here. So it is always a good idea to explicitly define the font weight, even if it is the same as the font weight in your body tag. As I mentioned before, something like font family, you don't need to explicitly define in your button, because in this application, all the text elements have the same font family. So by default, all our text properties will now inherit these styles.
if you remember from earlier on in this topic,
Once we define our base text properties on the body, we next go and set global font styles on type selectors. We've actually already done this. We have our default styling inside the body, and then we have specific styling on type selectors. For the font weight, we're setting it as 700, which will override this 400. The line height as 1.2, which will override this line height. This darker shade of gray, which will override this color. And we're also adding a new property on, the letter spacing of -2 pixels. And again, the reason these are overriding is because properties through inheritance have a very low specificity, and the type selector has a higher specificity. So these properties will override inherited properties. And then of course we're selecting each heading and applying its unique properties, like font size.
now if you remember just earlier,
We saw the power of applying text align on container elements, where it centers both inline and block elements. So let's now go and use this to our advantage inside the Quill project. With the hero section, it would be nice to center all of this content instead of just the H1. The feature section we're going to leave as it is, because that final layout has this content on the left with images on the right. The call to action section containing this heading and this anchor tag would also be nice to center, and the entire footer would also be great to center. So let's now code this up inside VS Code. I'm back inside the index.html file for our Quill project. I'm going to scroll down to the hero section and add in a class and give it the value hero section. I'm going to scroll down to the CTA section and give this a class of CTA section. And for the footer, I'm going to give this a class of footer. Now, of course, I could use the type selector in CSS and not add a class, but this is generally considered better practice. So heading over to app.css, I'm going to add the hero section class, grab the curly brackets, and add the property text-align center. I'll do the same thing with the CTA section, and the same thing with the footer. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see now that our hero section is all nice and centered. Same thing with our call to action section, and same thing with our footer. Now, just a few comments at this point. The first is, this does work using text-align center on a parent element to center all the children. And once again, like we've discussed, even the inline elements are centered, like the anchor tag over here or images over here. Now, the more modern way of handling alignment is with Flexbox and CSS Grid. You can check out my videos on those topics in the description below. So while this does work, later on in the CSS module, we will be exploring new modern and advanced methods. The next thing I want to comment is that these links over here and these images are actually a little bit off center. If you compare it to this text over here, you can see that the center line kind of comes down here to the right. If I go to DevTools and hover over this paragraph text here, you can see the blue box extends the full width of the page, whereas over here, the list item has a little bit of space on the left here, which when I hover over it goes green. This has to do with the CSS box model, and we'll be correcting this in my CSS box model video. But I just wanted to point that out now, in case you were wondering why this looks a bit funny down here. Before we finish up, I just want to tidy up our CSS file a bit. The first thing I want to do is remove text align where we no longer need it. I'm going to scroll up, and I'm going to remove text align on our H1, as we're now handling that with inheritance on the parent element. We had also previously defined text-align center on our H2. In our HTML, the H2 is used as a heading for each section. For example, the feature section has an H2, and the call to action section has an H2. The H2 over here is now being centered through inheritance that we defined over here. So if I remove text-align center from this H2, the H2 in the call to action section will still be centered, but the H2 in the feature section will no longer be centered. It generally isn't a good idea to have a text-align center set as a global style like this on an H2, because not all H2s will be aligned center, whereas all H2s will be 48 pixels. So to correct this, I'm going to delete the text-align property here, and I'm going to add a new class to this H2. We'll call it features main heading. Scrolling down in the CSS file, we'll add the class features main heading, and we'll give it the text-align property of center. So this is much better. I'm now just centering this heading for this particular instance, instead of globally using the H2 type selector. Let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, there's no actual net change. The heading 2 is still centered here, which is being controlled by this. And the heading 2 over here is also being centered, which is being controlled by inheritance over here. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just tidy the CSS document itself up a bit. You may be noticing things are now getting a little bit out of hand. We need some better structure to organize this. So what I'm going to do is split up the CSS document into 3 main sections. I'm going to add a comment by hitting Command/ on my Mac, add a whole bunch of dashes, and give this the title Global Styles. I'll copy these dashes on the other end as well. I'm just going to copy this entire comment as well, as I'll be using this syntax as a title below. So all these styles below are global styles. They're setting things like the font size of all H1s, or all the text properties on the body that are being inherited. The next series of styles I'm going to call components. These are pieces of reusable UI we're going to be using throughout the application. The button is a great example of a component. The next section is going to be called sections. These are different sections of our web page. And I'm going to put it in order as it appears on the page. I'm going to add a comment, and this time I'm only going to add a few dashes to make it appear as a subheading of sections. The first section with specific styling for is the hero section. I'll copy this for the next section, which is the features section. That's this piece of code over here. I'm going to cut that and pop it above over here. The next section we have is the CTA section, and the next section is the footer. So using comments to create headings like this helps better structure our CSS file, where we first have all our global styles, our different components, which we're going to be adding to as we move through the course, and different sections of the page, where we'll also be adding a whole bunch of new CSS rules.
Next, we'll see how to target all elements on a page with one simple rule using the Universal Selector.
We'll be discussing what is the Universal Selector and the Universal Selector versus body tag inheritance. So what is the Universal Selector? The Universal Selector applies styles to all elements. Let's take a look at this snippet of HTML. It contains a section and footer. In our CSS, I'm going to apply this style rule. The selector you see here is the Universal Selector. It's an asterisk symbol. The styles inside the declaration block applies to every single element. And when I say every element, I mean every element. Even structural elements like bodies, sections, and footers, as well as, of course, regular content elements like headings and paragraphs. So let's now play around with the Universal Selector inside VS Code. I've set up this simple HTML file where I've got a div container with the class of hero section, and inside it, I've got a heading 1, a paragraph, and a hyperlink. I've also linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. So let's go and add our Universal Selector, which is the asterisk symbol, grab our curly brackets, and let's add a few properties which will be applied to every single element. Let's make any text property with the color blue, and then I'm also going to add a border top of 5 pixel, solid, and let's make it red. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see that every text element we have is now blue, and every HTML element has a red border top. The border thickness is 5 pixels, but you can see in some locations it's a bit thicker. So let's have a look in DevTools why this is happening. I'm going to grab the inspector tool. I'm going to click on this first element here. This is the root HTML element, which is getting a red border top. It's this element here in our HTML. The next element is the body element, which is also getting a red border top. If I move my mouse down slightly, you can see that this box is the div container, which is also getting a red border top. Because these are just container elements, the body and the div, without any content between it, it's like the border tops are being stacked on top of one another, which makes them appear thicker. So in a nutshell, any properties that are applied on the Universal Selector are applied on every single element in your HTML.
Now I do quickly want to contrast this to inheritance, which we looked at earlier.
I'm going to just comment this out by highlighting it and hitting Command/ on my Mac or Control/ on a Windows. I now want to apply these same styles but using inheritance. I'll grab the body tag and I'll copy these styles in the curly brackets. I'm going to hit refresh, and what we can see is that only the blue color is being applied to our text, and the border top is only being applied once. It's only being applied to the body element, where this style is declared. And if you remember, it's because only text properties are inherited. So the color blue is inherited by all text children, whereas border top is a non-text property, so it's only being applied on the body.
Towards the end of this chapter, I will be doing a more comprehensive comparison
between what styles to put on a Universal Selector versus the body, as I know it can be a bit confusing, the subtlety between them. So let's now have a look at how we use the Universal Selector. So we'll now be going through the Universal Selector guidance. The Universal Selector is primarily used for resetting default properties and is not typically used for applying specific styling. It's like doing a factory reset on your computer or phone, completely clearing it out, making it how it was like when you first bought it. So what default properties are we actually resetting?
I'm back inside our Quill project where we got up to in the last chapter.
I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to grab the inspector and click on a few elements. We'll start with this heading. You can see on this heading, it's got some default margin, which is space between the element and other elements. You can see it in the orange. Same thing with the paragraph. It's got some built-in spacing called margin between the paragraph and the elements surrounding it. If I go up to our navigation bar, these list items, which are inside an unordered list, they've also got some default styling. If I hover over the left here to select the unordered list, you can see this green box, which is called padding. It's default styling rules applied to unordered lists, so that our lists get slightly indented. So we typically use the Universal Selector to remove this default styling of margin and padding. So the properties we put inside the Universal Selector have to do with the CSS box model properties, which I cover at great length in my video in the description below. So we don't really have much use for it right now, but we will be using it to remove the default spacing on elements, specifically margin and padding. Don't even worry about what those terms mean right now. Just realize it's not used for setting any text properties. Back in our Quill project, at the top of the global styles, I just want to go make a comment, which will be add in Universal Selector later to remove default spacing properties. So we can't use the Universal Selector just yet, because we still need to understand more about the CSS box model. But once we do understand that, we will replace this comment with the Universal Selector and some box model properties that will remove the default spacing. And while we're here, I just want to remind you again that we use inheritance on the body type selector to set all font properties. So just to drive the message home of the difference between the Universal Selector and body tag inheritance, I've created this table to compare them side by side, as I personally found it quite confusing to know what is used where. So let's start with the body tag and inheritance. The CSS properties we add inside the body only applies text properties to its children. So it's primarily used to set default text properties across our application. On the other hand, the Universal Selector applies all properties to all elements throughout the application, not just text properties. The Universal Selector is primarily used to reset default styles, which again, we need to learn about box model properties to implement this. In a one-sentence nutshell, the body tag and inheritance is used to apply styles, whereas the Universal Selector is used to remove styles. So that's probably the easiest way to think about it. Body tag and inheritance, adding text styles. Universal Selector, removing default styles. So let's finish up by continuing to add to our summary card inheritance and the Universal Selector. We looked at the Universal Selector, which applies styles to all elements. The Universal Selector is an asterisk symbol, and in this example, the color blue and border top is applied to every single HTML element. We saw that the guidance was the Universal Selector is most commonly used for resetting default styles. Finally, in the last chapter of this topic, we'll explore how to style specific parts of an element using pseudo-elements. We'll be discussing what are pseudo-elements, the pseudo-elements for text styling, selection, and content insertion. So what are pseudo-elements? Pseudo-elements are used to style a specific part of an element. They're not to be confused with pseudo-classes, which we saw was used to style a specific state of an element, like hovering over an anchor tag. Let's look at the syntax for a pseudo-element. We have a selector, like an H2, and then we add on our pseudo-element, which is made up of a double colon and the pseudo-element name. Now, just a small note at this point, pseudo-elements are not overly common. I'm not going to be using them throughout the course, but I do just want you to know that they do exist in case you see them out there in the wild. When I first learned CSS, I felt very overwhelmed with all the selectors I'd learnt, and especially scary worded ones like pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. Pseudo-classes are very, very important. You always use them on anchor tags. Pseudo-elements are not that common, so don't stress too much about them. So let's now take a look at different pseudo-elements. The first group of pseudo-elements have to do with text styling, where they're used to enhance visual appearance of text. The first example of this is the first letter pseudo-element, which, as the name suggests, will target the first letter inside a text element like a heading or paragraph, and this gives us something called a drop cap, which you can see in my image here, where the first letter will be larger than the rest. This kind of styling you'll often see in some publications like books or magazines. The other text styling pseudo-element is first line, which, as the name suggests, targets the first line of text, and often this will be a paragraph opening line, as a paragraph usually contains multiple lines of text. So let's play around with these in VS Code. I've prepared this index.html file ahead of time, It's got my boilerplate code and just an H1 and paragraph element. I've also linked an app.css style sheet, which is currently empty. So let's use the first letter pseudo-element to target this paragraph. I'll use the p-type selector, add 2 colons, and then add the pseudo-element name, first letter. I'll grab our curly brackets, and let's add some styles. A common one would be text transform to uppercase. This will give us that capital letter as the first letter. Let's make the font size 30 pixels, and let's give it a font weight of 700. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see in our paragraph, the L over here, which is the first letter of the paragraph, is uppercase. It's got a larger font size of 30 pixels, and it's got a font weight of 700. And as I said before, this is called a drop cap. I'm going to comment out this style. Let's go add the other pseudo element we saw. I'll again grab the paragraph, add 2 colons, and this time we're going to be using the first line pseudo element. I'll grab our curly brackets, and let's just use the same styles here. I'll copy them and paste them here. Let me refresh the browser, and you can see now the first line is all uppercase, has a font size of 30 pixels, and has a font weight of 700. So text styling with pseudo elements targets specific parts of the element. We saw first letter, and now first line. The next type of pseudo element is selection. This is used to visually enhance the text a user selects. And as you guessed, the pseudo element name is selection. Let's play around with this one in VS Code. I'm going to get rid of these styles. I'm going to grab the paragraph again, add my double colons, and add the pseudo element name selection. Add curly brackets, and let's give this a color of red. Let's see what this does in the browser. So initially, it doesn't look like any change. To see the selection pseudo element in action, we need to go and highlight the text. So I'm going to grab my cursor and select the text as if I'm going to copy it. And you can see it's turning red. So that's selection in action. The last pseudo element type is content insertion. This is used for adding decorative elements without altering the HTML structure. There are 2 content insertion pseudo elements. The first is before, and the second is after. As you could guess, using before adds the decorative elements before the HTML element you're targeting, and after adds the insertion after the element you're targeting. Let's have a look at this inside VS Code. Looking back on the HTML file, what I'd like to do is on my H1, I'd like to have a little beta symbol to signify that this application is in beta. Now, I don't really want that beta to be part of my HTML markup. It's kind of more like a little decorative element. It doesn't really make sense to have that inside my HTML structure. So I can use the before and after property to inject that element when the page renders. Heading over to app.css, I'm going to get rid of this style. I'm going to grab the H1, add 2 colons, and I'm going to use the after pseudo element. This will add the decorative element that I'm adding here after the H1. Now, a common property to use inside the before and after pseudo element is content. And we use quotation marks to write the content we want to appear. In this case, the word beta. And then we just use regular CSS text properties, like font size, which I'll make 12 pixels, and color, which I'll make purple. So let's see what this looks like in the browser. So you can see the word beta has been inserted into the page after my H1 heading. Now, usually you'd want to style this a bit more. You'd probably want to move it, say a little bit up and left, and also maybe give it a background color. Now, we can't do those things just yet because we need to learn more about positioning and the CSS box model, but you could imagine how this would look on a final page. And again, just to reiterate the subtlety of this beta is not actually an HTML element. It's being injected into the page when it renders. We can see this in DevTools as well. If I go into the heading, you can see welcome to the app, which is our heading text, and the pseudo element after, which has the properties we defined in our CSS.
So let's complete the summary card, inheritance, and the universal selector.
We looked at pseudo-elements, which styles a specific part of an element. We had a selector, like an H2, which was then followed by 2 colons and the pseudo-element name, like first letter. This gave us a pseudo-element. If you enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering CSS, you can join me in my CSS full course, which is available for free on my channel. It's the world's most detailed CSS full course designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code CSS at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build the Quill homepage from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the CSS full course.